And overall, what I see each and every day in my work, after doing this work now for almost 2 decades, you see the same patterns, you see the same, serial perpetrators, you see the same institutions and systems continuing to fail to acknowledge and normalize violence.
You're listening to the One Door podcast. One Door, a first-of-its-kind collaborative hub. One Door that will ensure women and families can access coordinated wraparound support in a safe, dignified, and supportive place. Welcome to the One Door podcast. Today we're sitting with Kristina Fifield, registered social worker and trauma therapist. Kristina, you are heavily involved with the Mass Casualty Commission, specifically the Avalon report, but you also work in private practice. Can you tell us a little bit about your background that drove you to this sort of work?
Yeah, since I did my bachelor's social work, started working at Bryony House is when I started to do gender-based violence and intimate partner violence work. And at the time of the mass casualty event that took place in 2020, I had because of what I was hearing and understood about what took place with Lisa Banfield and the perpetrators' long history of gender-based violence, I really wanted to get involved. So I was working at Bryony House at the time and working at Avalon Sexual Assault Center, and really wanted to bring the gender-based violence lens and intimate partner violence lens to the work. So was involved in a coalition with other community-based organizations, and the work that took place with the Avalon report. One of my colleagues, Shai Gordon, who was working and works with the African Nova Scotian community, was aware of the perpetrator and his history with in the impacts he had on marginalized individuals. So it was a piece of the work that was missing from the mass casualty events work that was taking place. So really did a lot of work behind the scenes pushing that the commission acknowledged the harms that took place prior to April 18th and 19th in 2020, because so much of the work was just looking at those 2 days. And I think it was really important that the perpetrator's long history with violence towards women, gender diverse individuals, and other people, community violence, was really understood in the lead up, and really trying to look at the preventative ways that his violence went unchecked and was so normalized for so many years. And I feel that it was really important to bring that lens and not miss all of the missed opportunities where violence was normalized with what people knew in community, how the systems and institutions failed to respond. And overall, what I see each and every day in my work, after doing this work now for almost 2 decades, you see the same patterns, you see the same, serial perpetrators, you see the same institutions and systems continuing to fail to acknowledge and normalize violence. So felt this was an opportunity where it took place in Nova Scotia, that this was an opportunity to really bring forward the gender-based violence and intimate partner violence lens to mass casualty events. And we know from previous mass casualty events that there's usually a history of violence towards women and gender diverse individuals. And that has been statistically seen in previous mass casualty events in Canada and in other places.
Okay. Thank you so much for that context. And there's a lot of topics there that I want to circle back to, especially the perpetrator's impact on the community prior to the actual date of the mass casualty. One thing that you mentioned just now is when you see serial perpetrators, how is it different now than prior to 2020 with the way those are being handled? Is there any mechanisms in place between communities, community organizations, and say the RCMP in flagging those and acting sooner?
Yeah, I would say that we're very far away from seeing the cultural shift, right?
Right.
I would actually say that since 2020 and all of the work I've been involved in, other people that are doing gender-based violence work, I would say that we're seeing increases in misogyny. We're seeing increases in extremism, manosphere spaces, online extreme forms of violence. So I think that and the Mass Casualty Commission's final report and the Turning the Tide Together really highlighted the cultural shift that needs to happen across society, right? And it's a whole society approach. I would say that what I see each and every day, whether it's in my individual work with clients that have been impacted or being impacted by gender-based violence or other forms of violence, is that they're still being failed, right? I think that there's more conversations since what took place in Nova Scotia. I would say that there is more conversations happening in the media. There is more, I would say, initiatives trying to figure out where do we start. But I would say that what I've seen over the last 18 years of work in doing this is that the individuals that are organizations that are doing this work have been really underfunded. The needs of community and the needs that survivors and families that are impacted by this form of violence continue to experience and face many barriers, including in community-based organizations that are providing services because of lack of resources or because of the complexities of the issue. So oftentimes, marginalized women, individuals experiencing that have experienced complex trauma, so they have developmental or attachment wounds, or they're using substances. Sometimes it's really difficult for them to navigate our current systems and even within community organizations. And I think because of the lack of funding, the lack of resources, and the lack of training, it's really difficult sometimes for individuals to get the support they need without facing further oppression and harm and marginalization. So,
So that's a theme that's come up quite a bit on the podcast, is that individuals struggling with addiction, it can provide an extra barrier. So is that, in a perfect world, would stronger in-treatment spaces for those individuals help facilitate the community women's centers to do their work?
Yeah, I would say that my experience in doing this work, and most of my career has been in community-based settings, doing gender-based violence work. I would say that the more that people are trained on this, the more that we acknowledge trauma responses connected to addictions, because too often, again, those individuals can be left out of services, right? Because many different, including transition houses, shelters, women's centers, they're trying to, keep other people safe, right? Or, it can bring up a lot of challenges in trying to navigate spaces where you're trying to have a safer space and then trying to meet the needs of the person. And oftentimes, again, I think there's a lot of fear. And I say this in training other social workers, people doing frontline work, other health-regulated professionals, is that we need to address the first and foremost the fear that we have. And until that happens, we're going to continue to see people that, are experiencing harm when they're accessing services. And
what could that look like on a practical level? So addressing that fear for a better outcome.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of attitudes and biases. I think there's a lot of folks that, including in community-based spaces, healthcare settings, that are really not comfortable with people using substances, right? There's a fear that their safety is going to be at risk. They don't understand the connections with trauma and how alcohol or substances can be used as a way of coping, and that it is a trauma response. And I think there's more education needed on that, and more education across the gender-based violence sector, but also across healthcare settings, police systems and institutions that are responding to individuals that have experienced gender-based violence. And I want to name, too, that substances is not the only barrier. It's too often women and gender-diverse individuals that have a history with maybe calling the police or maybe reaching out to community-based organizations or other service providers, is that when a woman or a gender diverse individual gets labeled with having borderline personality disorder, that label and that diagnosis is often weaponized against them, right?
Okay.
Including, and again, what I'm saying today is about educating, right, individuals. And we have a lot of work to do, even in community-based spaces, in understanding and acknowledging that diagnosis and really having compassion and understanding that it's directly connected oftentimes with trauma and those early attachment traumas. But it can be difficult, right, to navigate. And that's why I think the more that we're in tune with the things that are coming up for us, right, like the fear that comes up or our biases and maybe judgments, right, or the uncomfortable, right, we need to create space for that. And I think too often when I hear, survivors that are sharing their experiences with service providers, whether that's the healthcare system, whether that's a shelter, a women's center, or police, what I often see and hear is that the individuals that were responding to them, right, were not in a place of presence. They were in a place of being dysregulated because they were really uncomfortable or didn't feel they had the skills or tools to be able to navigate that. So I think it's really important that we're creating space for that, and we're creating professional development and training about that and awareness around that.
That's something that comes up a fair bit as well. And I think that was one of the big recommendations in the report was that industry get involved in some workplace training to help get people comfortable with these ideas. How has that been landing, in your opinion?
I would say that, when I have had conversations with the province on that, I think that's a huge opportunity. I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be. Back in, I believe, last fall or in 2025, harassment was added to our Occupational Health and Safety Act. And that's one thing that needs to be added, and we need to understand that from a gender-based violence lens. But I would say that too often things like misogyny, the different harms that are taking place in workplaces. A lot of gender-based violence is taking place in workplaces, and there's not nearly enough acknowledgement about that. And for individuals that are experiencing that form of harm and violence in workplaces, oftentimes when they go to their employer and report, or they put in a grievance with their union, or it gets to the place of, through the complaint process at the Department of Labor, it's again the individual's experience being minimized, or them being seen as a problem. The trauma response is not understood, and again, the violence being normalized. And I try to bring that forward when at the Mass Casualty Commission. That was one thing, and a few other experts across Canada were trying to highlight is that this violence he was using was actually taking place at work.
It was, a denture clinic.
Absolutely, with, his common law partner who also worked there. But, it took place with the patients he was providing care for. But the commission, the Mass Casualty Commission, said that that was not part of the mandate. I think it was a huge missing piece from the work that took place, and looking at that through what needs to take place in workplaces. I know the recommendations that came out are talking about training and things, but I do think there's more that has to happen. And it's not just simply by putting harassment in our Occupational Health and Safety Act. It's really ensuring people are trained. It's really ensuring that employers and unions are not normalizing when people are experiencing gender-based violence and other forms of harms, including racism and misogyny across society. There's so much education that needs to be done, and there does need to be accountability. And but we first need to have a shared understanding of that language and what it means.
Thank you for that. I want to go back a little bit to the creation of the report, and then we'll get back into some of that workplace discussion, because I think that's really, really important. So what was the process of creating the report like? What did you learn through interviews, research, and engagement with survivors and communities?
Yeah, so even to get that work initiated, it came right at the end of the commission because we were having a really hard time getting it even acknowledged.
Did you have to fight to get involved and have that gender-based violence lens that you wanted to bring to the work?
Yeah, so before even the Avalon report or that work with the survivors, when the community and families were calling on a commission, there was and still is a lot of people that do not see the connections to gender-based violence with the events that took place in April 2020. So right from the start, I was involved in this right from the start. There was a number of community-based organizations and coalitions that were looking at this through a gender-based violence lens, and we were participants in the inquiry. And I'm going to say that it was challenging. And even with my work, that came along here with the Progress and Monitoring Committee, it's been really difficult, right, with being in spaces where people don't see those connections to what took place. So that was right at the start of the inquiry being called. And then as I learned more and my colleagues learned more, and from participating in some of the roundtables and being a part of the day that gender-based violence was talked about, started to do a lot of work behind the scenes with the commission staff and trying to bring this forward. So there was many meetings around trying to bring this forward. I do think that, the commission staff, I think were doing the best they could with what was set out from the federal government and, the provincial government. But I do think that if we look at events, if anything similar happens going forward, I do think there's opportunities and lessons that we learned along the way that I think needs to be included in any future work. But it was very difficult around the gender-based violence piece. And then when we got approval, we wanted to make sure that we were not causing more harm. So because of oftentimes many survivors, when they bring their stories forward or they do speak up, sometimes people's trauma and experiences can be exploited. So we were really working hard, me and Shai and a few other colleagues were really working hard that the commission didn't do that they weren't misrepresenting what the survivors were sharing, that it was being done that it was being done with care, that people had choice. So we set up basically a trauma-sensitive way of approaching this work, honoring people's choices, and held the gatherings in spaces that the survivors identified were safe for them. So a lot of the work happened in library spaces. And that's where the individuals that had experienced harm from him felt most safe.
So it sounds like you made every effort to make it a safe space for them to talk and not become re-traumatized. Once it was out of your hands and into public opinion and media, how did you manage that side of things where, despite those best efforts, there could still be a lot of judgment applied to survivors and just the way that they had interacted with the perpetrator prior?
Yeah. So I think it's important to name, prior to Lisa Banfield testifying, me and a few others did media kits with media across the country, educating them on victim blaming, educating them on the harms that could come from how they were approaching communicating to the public about Lisa and how harmful that potentially was going to be, depending on those messages, to other people that are currently experiencing gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. So we did a lot of trying to educate the media first and foremost. And I'll just say that I co-authored the report and co-created it with the survivors and got them to make sure they were comfortable with everything. There was media I didn't speak to. And there was questions asked at the time around wanting more of those explicit details, wanting to sensationalize the details in it. And I just didn't partake in any of that. I think we actually have a lot more control than oftentimes people think, right? So I was prepared to shut down those conversations, right? And what people do with the information. But I felt that what we did at Avalon and, with my colleagues and other people doing gender-based violence work, we really try to highlight the harm that can come. I have no control over what, people in community do. I know from doing this work, and I know from being very publicly talking about Lisa Banfield and, even with her, the documentary that came out in January, right? I'm experiencing from people a lot of, hate at times and people, having lots of opinions and a lot of harmful comments about Lisa and other survivors. So I think we do the best we can, not participating, right, in it and saying no, right? So there was, and I say to media too, and I don't know how this will land actually saying this out loud, but, when I'm, sharing stuff, especially around sensitive information or oftentimes they'll let me read and make sure that they're not misrepresenting my words, right? And I think that with the work I do in building trust with survivors that have been so marginalized and so harmed and exploited, that's really important to me. So if the folks that I do media with, right, and reports, they know that and, they're good with that, right? And I've tried to really educate media and reporters around that because that's really important. And there's a lot of harm that can come through media, right? But it's an opportunity to educate and it's an opportunity to bring awareness. So, people ask me, you're a therapist, why do you talk, with media? And I think it's important, right? I don't personally like talking to media, but I see it as an opportunity to educate.
Part of the job.
It is part of the job, and it is educating people, right? And I think that is so important with the epidemic that we're currently experiencing in our province and across Canada with gender-based violence.
Together, we're building a healthier and safer future for generations to come. Your support will help create a safe, supportive, and empowering space where women, elderly, families, and youth can heal, learn, and thrive. To donate, visit onedoor.awrcsasa.ca. Every contribution, no matter the size, directly supports programs, services, and spaces that foster dignity, care, and community strength across rural Nova Scotia.